The Dakota prairie stretched flat and merciless under a sky heavy with unshed rain. Kota brought his pony to a halt on the crest of a low ridge, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene unfolding below. Two mounted men were circling a broken wagon like buzzards over carrion, and their horses kicking up small clouds of dust that hung in the humid air. A woman in a mud-streaked dress swung a shovel at them with the desperate, unpracticed movements of someone who had never had to defend herself before. A boy thin, perhaps 12, pressed himself against the wagon's side, clutching a small wooden trunk to his chest, as if it contained the last remnants of everything he owned. One of the riders laughed and kicked at the child's hands, trying to knock the trunk loose. Kota touched his heels to the pony's flanks and descended the slope without calling out. Words meant nothing to men like these. He simply placed himself between the riders and their prey, close enough that they would have to acknowledge his presence or trample him. The nearest man swore and reached for the rifle slung across his saddle. Kota's hand moved with the practiced economy of a man who had made such motions more times than he cared to count. He caught the rifle barrel mid-draw, twisted hard, and sent the weapon spinning to the ground as its owner howled and clutched his wrist. The second rider's hand flew to his pistol. The shot cracked loud in the heavy air, gouging a furrow in the wagon's side panel, close enough that splinters peppered Kota's cheek like angry hornets. When Kota turned to face them fully, his knife already drawn and held low and ready, both men decided their wages were not worth facing. A Lakota warrior who moved like water and struck like stone. They wheeled their horses and galloped back toward the line of hills that marked Aldrich Boone's territory, leaving nothing behind but hoofprints and curses. The woman lowered her shovel slowly. Her arms trembled from exertion and fear. She stared at Kota's face, and then at the white-tipped feathers of his war bonnet, her expression caught between gratitude and the kind of wariness frontier settlers learned early or died young. They said this road belongs to Boone. She said her words thick with the rolling cadences of German immigrant speech. My grandfather built a cabin 2 miles from here 30 years back. Those men called me a trespasser on my own family's ground. The boy looked from the retreating riders to Kota. His eyes wide and still wet with tears he was too proud to let fall. Thank you, mister, he whispered, his voice cracking. Kota slid the knife back into its sheath at his belt. You stand on land that was stolen twice, he said quietly. First from my people, then from yours. What was your grandfather's name? Hans Eller, the woman answered, straightening her spine with visible effort. I am Ida Muller. This is my son Gabriel. The name struck Kota like a fist to the chest, though he kept his face carefully neutral. He had heard that name before, whispered in saloons, mentioned in passing by drifters, connected somehow to the raid, 3 years past, that had taken his brother's life. The pieces had not yet formed a complete picture, but he felt them beginning to shift and align in his mind. Come, he said, scanning the horizon for signs of the rider's return. Standing in the open when Boone's men know where to find you is a good way to die badly. That night, Kota woke gasping in the narrow room he rented above the feed store in Coyote Springs. His heart hammered against his ribs as fragments of the dream scattered like startled birds. But some pieces remained sharp and clear, his brother Shatan, falling beneath a hail of bullets, blood spreading across trampled grass beside White Buffalo Creek. The crack of rifles echoing across the valley. And beneath it all, barely audible, a voice speaking in broken English, someone writing by lamplight, a pen scratching across paper numbers in neat columns, and there at the bottom of a page, Captain J. Harrow, services rendered, White Buffalo Creek. Kota pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes until colored lights bloomed behind his lids. 3 years since that raid. 3 years, and still his brother came to him in sleep, demanding answers that remained just beyond reach. The Army had called it a necessary action to clear hostile elements from settler range. Lakota had been scouting for a different company 200 miles east when it happened, or he would have died beside Shatan trying to shield the old ones who could not run fast enough. Sometimes he thought dying would have been simpler than living with the knowledge that he had served the very institution that had killed his own blood. He dressed in the darkness and walked through the sleeping town. Coyote Springs was a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled against the vastness of the prairie. A saloon that smelled of stale beer and broken promises, a general store with goods priced high enough to keep the desperate a livery stable. A few houses where the more prosperous citizens lived, behind glass windows and locked doors. Lakota's boots made no sound on the packed earth of the street. Moving quietly was a skill learned before walking refined through childhood games that prepared boys to become hunters and perfected through years of scouting for men who valued his abilities, but never quite saw him as human. At the saloon's rear entrance, he found Ida Mueller on her knees, scrubbing the floorboards by the guttering light of a single tallow candle. Her hands were raw and red from lye soap, the knuckles split and weeping. She looked up when his shadow fell across her workspace, and for a moment her entire body tensed like a rabbit, sensing the hawk's shadow. "It is only me," Lakota said, keeping his voice low and his hands visible. "I did not mean to startle you." Ida's shoulders relaxed fractionally. She sat back on her heels and pushed a strand of sweat-dampened hair from her face with the back of one reddened wrist. "I cannot sleep much these days," she said. "Might as well work while the night passes. At least then I feel I am doing something useful." Gabriel was curled on a blanket in the corner, sleeping with the boneless abandon of exhausted children. But even in sleep, his arms were wrapped protectively around the small wooden trunk. Lakota could see bruises darkening on the boy's forearms, where the rider's boot had connected. "Tell me about your grandfather," Lakota said, lowering himself to sit on an overturned crate. Ida wrung out her rag into a bucket of gray water and began scrubbing again, the repetitive motion seeming to help her organize her thoughts. "I never met him. My mother sailed to America separately, met my father in Pennsylvania, and settled there. But she spoke of Hans Eller, often a stubborn old German who homesteaded in Dakota Territory, when most settlers still feared to venture beyond the Missouri. He wrote letters for a time." Her hands stilled. Then they stopped. "We thought perhaps he had died of old age, or simply lost the habit of writing. When my husband was killed last year in a boiler explosion, I had nowhere else to turn. I thought if the cabin still stood, perhaps we could—" She trailed off, and Lakota saw the way her jaw tightened against tears that would serve no purpose. "What did Boone's men tell you?" he asked. "That Hans sold his land to Boone before he died. That he fell down his own well drunk and broke his neck like a common fool." She looked up at Lakota, and her eyes were hard despite the moisture gathering in them. "But my mother said Hans never touched liquor. His father drank himself to death in the old country, and Hans swore on his mother's grave that he would die sober or not at all. My mother believed him absolutely." Lakota felt something cold and heavy settle in his gut. "Did Hans's letters ever mention troubled disputes over land or water?" Ida nodded slowly. "The last letter my mother received, this would have been in the spring of 1852. I think he wrote that a rancher had made offers to buy his property. Hans refused. He said—" She closed her eyes, remembering. "He said, 'The creek waters more than just my cattle. If I sell to this man, the Lakota camps downstream will lose their access, and I will not have that sin on my conscience. Some things are worth more than money.'" The cold in Lakota's stomach spread through his chest, like frost forming on a winter pond. Early spring of 1852. Yes, April, I believe. 3 months before the raid at White Buffalo Creek. The raid that had killed Chatan, his brother, who at 22 had still believed the world could be reasoned with. The raid that had scattered 17 Lakota families, leaving 8 dead, including 2 elders too frail to run, and a child of 5 who had been shot while clinging to her grandmother's skirts. "I will take you to that cabin." Kota said the words coming out rougher than he intended. "But we go carefully, and we go prepared for trouble." Over the next 2 days, Kota made quiet inquiries in Coyote Springs and the surrounding country. He learned that Aldrich Boone had arrived in the territory in late 1851 with money from Eastern investors and ambitions to carve out a cattle empire that would span from the Missouri River to the Black Hills. He learned that Sheriff Montgomery Pike owed his badge and his salary to Boone's political support, and that the telegraph operator had once been caught delaying messages that contradicted Boone's interests, though the charges had mysteriously disappeared. He learned that small ranchers who challenged Boone's boundary fences tended to suffer unfortunate accidents. Fires, stampedes, wells poisoned with arsenic. Most tellingly, he learned from an aging cavalry quartermaster with a taste for whiskey and a conscience that still occasionally troubled him, that in the spring of 1852, a certain Captain J. Harrow had received a payment of $500 in gold from private benefactors to conduct what the official reports called a necessary punitive action against hostiles threatening settler interests near White Buffalo Creek. When Kota pressed for the names of these benefactors, the quartermaster had laughed bitterly and poured himself another drink. "Who do you think, boy, same man who ended up controlling all the water rights in that valley after the Indians cleared out? Same man who told me if I ever spoke about it to anyone official, I would be found face down in an arroyo with a Sioux arrow in my back, never mind that there were no Sioux within 100 miles. The old man's hands shook. I took his money too. We all did. We all bought into the lie that it was progress civilization making the territory safe. Now I can't sleep without whiskey, and even that doesn't always work." Kota had walked away from that conversation before his hands could find the quartermaster's throat. Rage would accomplish nothing. He needed evidence, not revenge. Though some dark corner of his heart whispered that perhaps he needed both. Dr. Phineas Clark proved more helpful. The physician was a lean, sharp-eyed man in his middle 50s, with hands that trembled slightly until the moment they touched a patient, at which point they became steady as stone. He had come west after gambling debts destroyed his practice in Philadelphia, found sobriety on the trail, and rebuilt his skills treating everything from arrow wounds to childbed fever in towns too poor or too remote to attract more reputable doctors. "Hans Eller was my patient," Dr. Phineas told Kota over bitter coffee in his cramped surgery. "I set a broken arm for him once he got it caught between his plow and a boulder he was trying to shift. Toughest old man I ever met. He struck me as the sort who would die of pure stubbornness at the age of 90, still arguing with the Almighty about whether it was really his time." The doctor's expression darkened. "When I heard he had fallen drunk down a well, I knew it was a lie. But by the time I examined the body, it had been in the ground a week. Boone's men said they had found him and buried him out of Christian charity." "Did you ask questions?" I asked. Dr. Phineas refilled both their cups from a battered tin pot. "And then my surgery suffered a mysterious fire that destroyed half my medical supplies and nearly took the building. The fire brigade arrived unusually late that night. I understood the message clearly enough. If I find proof of what really happened to Hans Eller..." Kota said slowly, "Would you be willing to testify?" Dr. Phineas studied him for a long moment. "I have very little courage," he said finally. "I ran from my debts in Philadelphia rather than face them. I hide in this frontier town, treating people's ills instead of confronting the illness in my own soul. But I have even less tolerance for watching evil men prosper, while good men rot in unmarked graves." He extended his hand. "Yes, I will testify if you can get the evidence to someone who will listen. The third person Coda approached was Dusty Bill, a card-sharp and odd-job man who dealt faro at Whiskey Tom's saloon and ran errands for Boone when the rancher needed something done quietly. Bill was perhaps 50, though the hard living had etched lines in his face that made him look a decade older. His eyes held the particular emptiness Coda had seen before in men who stared too long into whiskey glasses, searching for redemption they knew they would never find. Coda found him alone in the saloon's back room, counting a thin stack of coins and marking figures in a worn notebook. "I need information," Coda said without preamble. Bill looked up slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Information costs money, or silence, sometimes both." "Hans Eller's death. You were in Boone's employ then. What do you know?" Bill's face went blank as fresh paper. "Old man fell down a well drunk. Tragic accident. Happens." Coda set a gold eagle on the table, most of his remaining wages from his last scouting contract. The coin gleamed dully in the lamplight. The truth costs less than lies in the long run. Lies have a way of eating a man from the inside. Bill stared at the coin for a long time, so long that Coda thought he would refuse. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, the words coming out as if each one cost him something precious. "I know that some nights I drink until I cannot see straight, and it still does not erase the memory of holding a lantern while a man screamed at the bottom of a well." He pushed the coin back across the table with a trembling hand. "Keep your money, and keep that widow and her boy away from that cabin if you value their lives." "Why?" "Because Boone does not leave loose ends. And whatever Hans Eller hid before he died, Boone has been searching for it ever since. He tears apart that cabin every few months, has men watching it. If he thinks that woman knows where her grandfather hid his secrets." Bill's voice trailed off, and he took a long pull from a flask he produced from his coat. "Just keep them away. That is all I will say." But his eyes, haunted and red-rimmed, said far more than his words ever could. Ida refused to be frightened off. When Coda found her the next morning outside the livery where Gabriel was earning pennies mucking stalls, she stood with her arms crossed and her jaw set in a way that reminded him of warriors preparing for a battle they knew might be their last. "If my grandfather hid something, then it belongs to me and Gabriel by right of blood," she said. "I have run from enough from my husband's death, from poverty, from towns that did not want German immigrants taking jobs. I will not run from my own family's land." Gabriel, listening from the doorway, with manure still clinging to his boots, spoke up in a voice that tried to sound brave, and mostly succeeded. "I want to see it too, Ma. I never knew great-grandfather Hans. This might be the only piece of him we will ever have. Even if it is just a burned-out ruin, I want to stand where he stood and know that we came from someone who mattered." Coda looked at the determination in their faces and recognized something he had felt himself many times, and the desperate need to connect to a past that kept slipping away like water through cupped hands. He thought of Chatan and how he would have felt if someone had told him to forget, to let the dead rest, to stop asking questions that made powerful men nervous. "All right," he said. "But we do this my way. We move carefully. We watch for Boone's men. And if I say we run, you run without argument." "Agreed." Ida and Gabriel nodded in unison. They prepared through the rest of that day. Dr. Phineas lent them 3 horses, the best from his small stable, and pressed a small 5-shot revolver into Ida's hands, along with a leather pouch of ammunition. "Your husband taught you to shoot," you said. "Do you remember?" "I remember," Ida said, checking the cylinder with movements that were unpracticed, but not entirely unfamiliar. "I am not a good shot, but at close range I can hit what I aim at." Close range is all that matters in a fight, the doctor said. Distance shooting is for sport. Close shooting is for survival. They left Coyote Springs before dawn, on a morning when low clouds pressed down like a wet wool blanket, and thunder rumbled in the distance, promising rain that had not yet fallen. Coda led them along paths that avoided the main road game trails and dry creek beds where horses left few tracks routes through broken country, where a rider watching from high ground could not see them approach. As they rode, Coda pointed out landmarks and signs of lightning-split cottonwood that marked the old boundary of Lakota hunting territory. A circle of stones where his people had once held ceremonies a spring, where soldiers had camped the night before the raid that killed Shatan. He did not speak of that last landmark's significance, but something in his voice must have changed because Ida glanced at him sharply. "You have lost someone here," she said. It was not a question. "My brother. 3 years ago in the raid that cleared this valley for Boone's cattle." Coda kept his eyes on the horizon. He was 22. He died trying to help an elder woman reach cover. The soldiers shot them both. Ida was silent for several moments. Then, "I am sorry. I know those words are inadequate, but I do not know what else to say." "There is nothing to say," Coda replied. "Some debts cannot be paid with words." Gabriel, riding beside them, spoke up hesitantly. "Is that why you are helping us to get back at the man who hurt your brother?" Coda considered lying, then decided the boy deserved honesty. "Partly. But also because your great-grandfather tried to do the right thing even when it would have been easier to take Boone's money and look away. That kind of courage is rare. It should not be forgotten." They reached White Buffalo Creek by midday. The water ran swift and clear, swollen with snowmelt from distant mountains, carrying the particular cold that comes from ice barely melted. Coda dismounted and studied the muddy bank, carefully reading the tracks like words on a page deer and antelope. The distinctive marks of a bear's claws, where it had fished for trout, and more recently, the hoofprints of 2 horses. One shod, one not. "Boone's men were here yesterday," he said quietly. "Probably checking the cabin, making sure no one has been nosing around." They forded the creek at a point where the water ran shallow over a bed of smooth stones. The horses picked their way carefully, and the icy water soaked through boots and trouser legs, numbing toes and making teeth chatter. Midway across, Gabriel's horse stumbled on a moss-slick rock. The boy slid sideways in the saddle with a yelp of fear. Coda reacted instantly, spurring his mount close and catching Gabriel's coat before the current could drag him under. "Easy," Coda said, steadying the boy. "The water is strong here. It can break your skull on rocks downstream if you go under. Respect it." Gabriel nodded, his face pale, his hands gripping the saddle horn so tightly his knuckles showed white through the skin. Once they reached the far bank, Ida dismounted and pulled her son into a fierce embrace, heedless of the water streaming from both their clothes. "You scared me half to death," she said, her voice muffled against his wet hair. "I am all right, Ma," Gabriel replied, but he clung to her for a moment before pulling away, embarrassed by his own fear. From the creek, the land rose gently toward a stand of cottonwoods, and beyond them, barely visible through the trees, Coda could make out the gray, weathered shape of Hans Eller's cabin. The cabin looked like something the prairie had been trying to swallow for years and was nearly succeeding. Gray boards warped and split by seasons of heat and cold, a roof that sagged dangerously in the middle shutters, hanging askew on rusted hinges. Someone had painted Boone's brand on the door in white paint, but time and weather had faded it to a ghostly outline. Inside, dust lay thick as a blanket over everything. The air smelled of mouse droppings, mildew, and abandonment. Broken furniture lay scattered where it had been tossed by searchers, a chair with 3 legs, a table split down the middle. Shattered bottles that had once held whiskey or lamp oil. A tattered blanket on the sagging bed frame had been chewed by mice into something resembling lace. Ida stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking in every detail. Her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. Gabriel found an old lantern on a shelf coated with grime and managed to coax it to life with a match from his pocket and the stub of candle remaining inside. The light pushed back shadows and revealed more initials carved into a ceiling beam, HE 1843, a rusted horseshoe nailed above the door for luck that had clearly run out, and a cracked photograph in a tarnished frame showing a stern-faced man with a thick beard standing beside a young woman holding a baby. "That is my mother," Ida whispered, picking up the frame with trembling hands. "She must have been 2 or 3 years old. And that is Hans, my grandfather." She traced the image with one fingertip, as if trying to reach across the decades and touch the man she had never met. While mother and son studied the photograph, Coda examined the floor. The boards were rough-cut pine fitted closely, but warped with age and moisture. Near the stone fireplace, one board sat slightly higher than its neighbors, as if something beneath prevented it from settling flush. He knelt and worked his knife blade into the gap. The board resisted nails groaning, then came up with a sharp crack. Beneath it, nestled in the space between floor joists, was a cloth-wrapped bundle secured with waxed twine that had somehow resisted rot. "Gabriel," Coda said quietly, "bring the light here." The boy hurried over, and Ida followed. In the lamplight, Coda carefully cut the twine and folded back layers of oilcloth. Inside were papers, a ledger bound in cracked leather, its pages covered with neat handwriting. A hand-drawn map marked with survey lines, creek courses, and property boundaries. A sealed envelope yellowed with age. And a deed bearing an official territorial seal and the name Hans Eller, written in formal copperplate script. Ida reached for the envelope with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped it. She was about to break the seal when boots hammered across the porch outside. The door exploded inward, slamming against the wall hard enough to crack plaster. Hard Harry filled the doorway, flanked by 2 other riders, all 3 with pistols drawn, and faces set in expressions that promised violence. Hard Harry was a thick-necked man, with a scar running from his left eyebrow to his jaw, the souvenir of a knife fight he had won by stabbing his opponent in the kidney while shaking hands to call a truce. "Well, well, Hard." Harry drawled, his eyes flicking from Coda to the papers in Ida's hands. "Looks like we got us some trespassers, and they found something that does not belong to them." Coda rose slowly, placing himself between the gunman and Ida. His hand drifted toward his knife, though he knew a knife would be useless against 3 drawn pistols. "This woman is Hans Eller's granddaughter. This cabin and everything in it belongs to her by law and by blood. Boone's deed says different." Hard Harry's grin showed teeth stained brown from chewing tobacco. "Now you can hand over those papers peaceable-like, or we can take them after we shoot you. Makes no difference to us either way. We get paid the same." The other 2 riders moved to flank them, trying to get clear lines of fire. The cabin's small interior gave them limited room to maneuver, which was the only advantage Coda had. They could not all shoot at once without risking hitting each other. "You fire a gun in here, people will hear." Coda said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline singing through his veins. "Someone will ask questions. You will have to explain why you murdered a widow and her child in cold blood." Hard Harry shrugged. "We will say you went crazy. Savage Indian trying to rob honest settlers. Folks will believe it. They always do." Gabriel, standing behind Coda, made a small sound, half sob, half gasp. The boy was trying desperately not to cry, not to show weakness, but fear had him by the throat. Coda felt a surge of protective rage so strong it nearly overwhelmed his tactical thinking. Then Ida did something that surprised everyone in the room. She raised the small revolver Dr. Phineas had given her and pointed it directly at the lantern sitting on the floor beside the bundle of papers. "You shoot us. I shoot the lantern," she said, her voice remarkably steady, considering the pistol wavered slightly in her grip. "This whole cabin is dry as tinder. It will go up like a torch. We will all burn together, and those papers burn with us. Boone gets nothing." Hard Harry's grin faded. "You are bluffing, woman." "Am I?" Ida's finger tightened visibly on the trigger. The hammer clicked back with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "I have already lost my husband, my home, everything I owned. What makes you think I fear dying? At least this way you devils do not win." For a long moment, no one moved. Kota could hear his own heartbeat, could smell the sweat and tension in the room, could see the calculation happening behind Hard Harry's eyes as the man weighed risks and rewards. Finally, Hard Harry made a small gesture with his pistol. "Outside, all of you. Bring the papers." They filed out into air that had grown thick and heavy with the approaching storm. Thunder rumbled closer now, and the first fat raindrops began to fall, kicking up small puffs of dust where they struck the parched earth. The moment they cleared the doorway, two of Boone's men grabbed Kota's arms and slammed him face first against the cabin wall. Someone drove a knee into his spine, while rough hands yanked his arms behind his back and bound his wrists with rope, jerking the knots so tight that blood flow cut off almost immediately. Hard. Harry took the bundle of papers from Ida and rifled through them, his lips moving as he tried to decipher Hans's handwriting and the legal language of the deed. "Boone is going to want to see these personal-like," he said finally. "Question is, what do we do with you folks in the meantime?" "Let them go," Kota said, twisting his head to look at Hard Harry despite the pressure on his spine. "Take the papers to Boone. They have no copies. They cannot prove anything without the originals." "Maybe." Hard Harry looked at Ida and Gabriel thoughtfully. "Or maybe they ride straight to the nearest federal marshal and tell tales about murder and stolen land. Tales that might interest the law more than Boone would like papers or no papers." One of the other riders, a young man with cruel eyes and a thin mustache, spoke up. "Creek is running high with the rain coming. Folks drown all the time in spring floods. Natural accident." Ida's face went pale as milk, but she kept her spine straight and her hand firm on Gabriel's shoulder. The boy was shaking now, unable to hide his terror tears streaming down his cheeks, mixing with the rain that was falling harder with each passing moment. "Get them mounted," Hard Harry ordered. "Hands bound. We will figure out the details on the way." They were forced onto horses with their wrists tied behind them, the rope cutting deep and sending sparks of pain shooting up Kota's arms. His mind raced through possibilities. The knots were professionally tied, but the man who had bound him had made one critical mistake. He had tied wrists, not fingers. Kota began working immediately, using the horse's swaying motion to hide the subtle movements as he felt for the pattern of the knot, searching for its weak point. The small group moved at a walk toward White Buffalo Creek, now swollen and roaring with the sudden downpour. Hard Harry led, followed by one rider, then the three captives, and then the remaining man, bringing up the rear. Rain fell in sheets, cold and hard, soaking through clothes, making visibility difficult. Thunder crashed overhead so close that Kota felt it in his chest. They were halfway to the creek when Gabriel's horse shied violently at a crack of lightning that split the sky. The boy, off balance with his hands bound, slid sideways in the saddle. Without thinking, Kota spurred his mount forward and shouldered Gabriel upright before he could fall. Hard Harry wheeled around, pistol raised and cocked. "Try that again, and I shoot the boy first, then you, then the woman. In that order so you can watch." But the distraction had given Kota the seconds he needed. His fingers found the rope's bitter end where it tucked through the final loop. He pulled with all his strength, ignoring the pain, as hemp tore his already raw skin, and felt the binding loosen fractionally. They reached the creek to find it transformed. What had been a clear, knee-deep ford that morning was now a raging brown torrent, carrying branches, uprooted sage, and debris. The water had risen at least 3 feet and was still climbing, fed by the deluge hammering down from the storm. Upstream, hard. Harry shouted over the roar of water and thunder. There is a narrower crossing between the rocks. They rode along the bank's spray, misting their faces, the horses nervous and rolling their eyes at the violence of the flood. Lakota kept working the rope, his wrists now slick with blood that helped the binding slide. Behind him, he heard Ida speaking softly to Gabriel. In German words he could not understand, but whose tone was unmistakable courage, love, preparation for what might come. The upstream crossing was indeed narrower, the water funneling between 2 rock ledges that created a natural choke point. But the current was even faster here, more dangerous, capable of sweeping a horse off its feet and dashing it against the rocks downstream. Hard Harry sent his youngest rider across first to test the crossing. The man made it, but his horse lunged and stumbled badly on the far side, nearly throwing him before finding purchase on the bank. "You next," Hard Harry told Lakota, gesturing with his pistol. "If you fall, you fall. We will tell Boone you tried to escape." Lakota urged his horse into the current. The water hit like a physical blow, cold enough to stop breath, strong enough to make the horse stagger. Brown water rose to Lakota's waist, the current tugging at his legs with the insistence of living hands trying to pull him under. Foam flew from the horse's lips as it struggled, hooves scrabbling for purchase on stones made treacherous with silt and moss. Midstream, the current swung the horse sideways. For a heartbeat, they were broadside to the full force of the flood, and Lakota felt the animal's legs start to give way beneath the pressure. And then his hands came free. The rope finally loosened enough by his struggles, and the water's relentless pull slipped over his bloody wrists and disappeared into the brown churn. Lakota did not hesitate. He threw himself sideways out of the saddle, aiming for Hard Harry's horse that had just entered the ford behind him. The world became brown chaos. Water filled his mouth and nose, the roar drowning out all other sound. His boots struck stone and he pushed off hard surfacing just as Hard Harry's horse plunged past. Lakota grabbed the rider's leg and pulled with all his strength. Hard Harry, caught completely off guard, toppled from the saddle with a shout of fury. They grappled in the current, neither able to get solid footing, fists and elbows striking blindly. Hard Harry got a hand on his pistol and tried to bring it to bear. Lakota caught his wrist and slammed it against a rock with bone-breaking force. The gun fired underwater, the sound muffled and strange, the bullet going wild. Hard Harry's wrist shattered with a crack that Lakota felt more than heard, and the man screamed into the water. On the near bank, Ida's horse and Gabriel's mount balked at the edge, refusing to enter the flood. The rider, who had been bringing up the rear, raised his rifle, trying to get a clear shot at Lakota through the spray and chaos. Ida, her hands still bound, drove her horse straight into the rifleman's mount. The collision sent both animals' rearing hooves flailing. The rifle discharged into the air as the rider fought to stay in the saddle. "Gabriel, run!" Ida screamed. "Back to the cabin." But the boy froze, paralyzed by terror and confusion, unable to make his body obey his mind's commands. On the far bank, the first rider who had crossed spurred back into the water, trying to reach Hard Harry before the current dragged him away. Lakota saw his chance. He released Hard Harry, letting the man's broken wrist and the current's pull do the work of neutralizing him, and lunged for the loose horse still struggling in midstream. He got a handful of mane and dragged himself partially across the animal's backwater, streaming from his clothes. "Ida!" he shouted. "To me now." Ida did not waste time with questions. She kicked her balking horse savagely, driving it into the current through sheer force of will. The animal plunged forward, stumbled, and then Ida was in the water, too torn from the saddle by the flood's violence. Lakota saw her go under, her dark hair streaming like seaweed. He drove his captured horse toward where he had seen her disappear, scanning the churning surface frantically. There, a flash of pale hand breaking the water's surface. He reached down and grabbed caught fabric and flesh and hauled with all the strength left in his exhausted arms. Ida surfaced, gasping and choking, her hands still bound behind her back. Lakota got an arm around her waist and pulled her against a boulder, using his body to shield her from the current's full force. For one breathless moment, they were pressed together, faces inches apart, sharing the same ragged gasps for air, while water clawed at them. Then his horse found footing and lunged for the far bank, dragging them both by the momentum. They tumbled onto muddy ground, coughing and retching. Gabriel's horse, following instinctively, crashed up beside them. Moments later, the boys still clinging to the saddle and sobbing openly now. Behind them, Hard Harry's men shouted and fired shots that went wild, but they were unwilling to risk the crossing with the flood at its peak. Lakota did not waste time looking back. He cut Ida's bonds with his knife, blessedly still in its sheath, then grabbed both horses' reins and ran. They ran. They reached White Buffalo Town an hour later, soaked, bleeding, exhausted, and moving only through sheer, desperate momentum. The horses were lathered and blowing, pushed beyond safe limits. Gabriel had stopped crying, but was shaking so badly he could barely stay in the saddle. Ida's hands were white where they gripped the reins, and Lakota could see the shock setting in the delayed reaction that came when survival instinct finally released its grip. Dr. Phineas saw them coming and pulled them directly into his surgery through the back entrance, barring the door behind them. He asked no questions, just immediately began stripping away wet clothes and examining injuries. Lakota's wrists were raw and bleeding, torn nearly to the bone in places. Ida had a gash on her scalp where she had struck a rock underwater, and bruises were already darkening across her ribs. Gabriel was uninjured physically, but mentally and emotionally wrung out. The doctor worked in silence, cleaning wounds with carbolic acid that burned like liquid fire, stitching Lakota's wrists with neat, precise sutures, bandaging Ida's head. Only when everyone was wrapped in blankets and Gabriel was sleeping fitfully in the corner did Dr. Phineas finally speak. What happened? Between them, Lakota and Ida told the story. When they finished, the doctor's face was grim. We need those documents. Without the originals, we have nothing but stories, and stories will not stand up against Boone's money and influence. Hard Harry has them, Lakota said. By now he has delivered them to Boone. Then we are finished. Ida said, her voice hollow with defeat. Not necessarily. Dr. Phineas went to a cabinet and retrieved a small leather satchel. From it, he pulled papers, copies made in his own neat handwriting. I copied the most important pages last night after you told me what you were planning to search for. The deed excerpts from the ledger showing the payments to Boone's men and to Captain Harrow. Hans's letter accusing Boone of attempted murder. It is not as good as having the originals, but it is something. Lakota took the copies and read them carefully. Dr. Phineas had done excellent work. The handwriting was clear, the details precise. But Ida was right to be discouraged. Copies could be dismissed as forgeries. They needed the originals, or they needed something more. There is a circuit judge coming to Willow Gap in 4 days, Dr. Phineas said. Judge Alden. He is one of the few truly honest men in the territory, cannot be bought, cannot be threatened. If we can get evidence to him, he will act on it. Boone will have destroyed the originals by then, Ida said. Maybe. Or maybe he will keep them, thinking they are safe in his possession. Lakota was thinking quickly now, his mind working through possibilities. Boone is arrogant. He has gotten away with murder and theft for years. He might keep the documents as trophies evidence of how clever he has been. That is a lot of maybes, Dr. Phineas said. It is all we have. They spent the rest of that day and night in hiding, afraid that Boone's men would come looking for them. But no one appeared. The following morning, Dusty Bill slipped into the surgery through the same back entrance, looking like death itself. Pale, sweating, trembling so badly, he could barely hold the whiskey bottle he carried. "I heard what happened at the creek," he said without preamble. Hard Harry came back with his wrist in splints, spitting fury and swearing revenge. But he also brought Paper's old documents from Hans Eller's cabin. Boone has them now locked in the safe in his office. "How do you know this?" Coda asked. "Because Boone sent me to town to fetch the locksmith, said his safe was jamming and he needed it adjusted. But I saw him put the papers inside first. He was smiling like a man who had just won a fortune at cards." Bill took a long pull from his bottle. "There is more you need to know. Things I should have told you from the start." He sank into a chair and began to speak the words, coming out in fits and starts, as if each one had to be dragged from some deep well of shame and self-loathing. It was April 15th, 1852. Boone brought 4 of us to Hans's cabin late at night after midnight, when honest folks were sleeping. He had a deed already prepared, all legal-looking with fancy seals. He told Hans to sign it, said he was offering 3 times fair value for the land. Hans refused. Said the water belonged to everyone who needed it, not just whoever could afford to buy it. Boone's men grabbed Hans, held him down on his own table. They got his hand on a pen and tried to force him to make his mark, but Hans fought like a devil old as he was. He was strong. He broke free, punched one man in the face, grabbed a knife off the wall. We chased him outside. He was trying to reach his shotgun. He kept it propped by the well for varmints, but Boone got there first. They struggled. Hans called Boone a thief and a devil in 2 languages. And Boone just shoved him. Straight backward, down into the well. Ida made a sound like she had been punched in the stomach. Gabriel, awake now, stared at Dusty Bill with wide, horrified eyes. "I held the lantern," Bill continued, his voice breaking. "I stood at the edge and held the lantern so Boone could see that Hans was dead at the bottom. I saw his neck bent at an angle that was not natural. Saw the water turning dark with blood. Heard the sound he made when he hit this wet crunch that I still hear every night when I close my eyes." He took another drink, his hand shaking so badly that whiskey spilled down his chin. Boone paid us each $50 to keep quiet. He filled the well part way with rocks to hide the body. Then he took that unsigned deed to town and came back 3 days later with Hans's signature forged at the bottom, paid a clerk in the land office to make it look official. We spread the story that Hans had been drinking, fell down drunk. Everyone believed it because they wanted to believe it. Easier than asking hard questions. "You are a murderer," Ida said, her voice shaking with rage. "You stood there and let my grandfather die, then took money to stay silent." "Yes," Bill said. He did not look away from her, did not try to defend himself. "That is exactly what I am. And I have been trying to drink myself to death ever since. But apparently I am too much of a coward even to do that properly." Coda forced himself to speak past the fury closing his throat. "What about the raid, the one at White Buffalo Creek 3 months later?" Bill nodded miserably. "That was Boone's idea too. Hans's land gave him access to the creek, but he wanted the whole valley clear. No Lakota camps, no one to challenge his claim to the water. He said they were squatting on range that should go to productive use. He paid Captain Harrow $500 in gold to lead a raid. Harrow reported it as a response to stolen cattle, but there were no stolen cattle. It was murder, plain and simple. Paid murder." Coda's vision narrowed to a red tunnel. His brother's face swam before him, Chatan laughing, Chatan teaching him to track deer, Chatan dying in mud and blood because a rancher wanted uncontested water rights. He was halfway out of his chair, hands reaching for Bill's throat before Dr. Phineas and Ida grabbed him. "He is not worth hanging for," Ida said urgently, though her own hands were clenched into fists. "He is dying already, anyone can see it. Consumption or drink or shame. He will be dead inside a year." Bill nodded. "Doctor told me 6 months, maybe less." He fumbled in his coat and produced a folded paper stained and wrinkled. "2 days ago, when Boone sent me to his office, I stole this from his safe. It is a letter from Captain Harrow thanking Boone for his generous contribution to maintaining frontier order and confirming that the hostile element at White Buffalo Creek had been permanently removed. Harrow even listed the casualties' numbers, ages, how they died. He wrote it like a military report, like they were counting dead animals instead of people." He handed the letter to Coda with a trembling hand. "I am a coward and a murderer and probably damned beyond any salvation. But I am done carrying Boone's water. When your judge comes, you can use this. And you can use my testimony. Whatever is left of my miserable life, I will spend it trying to balance the scales." Coda read Captain Harrow's letter slowly, forcing himself to take in every detail. 17 hostile combatants neutralized. 2 confirmed elderly, likely in their 60s. 1 juvenile female, approximately 5 years of age, eliminated during necessary suppression of resistance. Minimal ammunition expenditure. Operation successful. His brother reduced to a number in a casualty count. An operation successful. "Why now?" Coda asked, his voice hoarse. "Why help us now after all these years of silence?" Bill met his eyes. "Because I am dying anyway, and I realize that dying with this on my conscience would be worse than whatever waits for me on the other side. And because that woman and her boy deserve to know the truth about what happened to Hans. He was a good man. One of the only good men in this whole sorry territory. He deserves better than to be remembered as a drunk who fell down his own well." Father Matthias, who had entered quietly during Bill's confession, spoke from the doorway. "Confession and repentance, even this late, still matter in the eyes of heaven." "Maybe," Bill said, "but they will not bring back the dead. Nothing will do that." They spent the rest of the day planning. With the copies of Hans's documents, Bill's testimony, and Captain Harrow's letter, they had enough evidence to interest Judge Alden if they could reach him before Boone found a way to make them all disappear permanently. "The judge will not arrive in Willow Gap for 3 more days," Dr. Phineas said. "That gives Boone time to hunt us down and destroy any evidence we might have." "We cannot hide for 3 days," Ida said. "He will find us eventually. This town is too small and he owns too many people." "Then we do not hide," Coda said slowly, an idea forming. "We force Boone to act before he is ready. We make him expose himself." They gathered around Dr. Phineas's table, Coda, Ida, Dr. Phineas, Father Matthias, and Dusty Bill, and worked out a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. No one was quite certain which. Coda would ride openly to Boone's ranch and offer a trade the copies of the documents which he would claim were originals in exchange for safe passage out of the territory for himself, Ida, and Gabriel. Boone, believing he could get back the papers and eliminate the witnesses, would agree to a meeting at Hans Eller's cabin neutral ground where he would feel in control. But the meeting would be observed. Dr. Phineas would alert Judge Alden early, asking him to come to White Buffalo immediately. Father Matthias, who had 6 brothers working as freight haulers in the territory, would quietly ask them to serve as additional witnesses. And they would reach out to 2 small ranchers who had lost land to Boone's schemes, Robert Hart and his wife, known as Sweet Sue, who were known to have rifles and the skill to use them. If we can get Boone to confess in front of multiple witnesses that he cannot threaten or bribe. Lakota said, "The judge will have no choice but to act." "Boone is not stupid," Ida said. "He will bring men. He will try to kill us regardless of any deal." "Yes," Lakota agreed. "That is why we need to be ready for a fight." The next morning, Lakota rode to Boone's ranch alone, carrying a white cloth tied to a stick, a flag of parley. The ranch sprawled across a valley, bunkhouses, barns, corrals, holding hundreds of cattle, and a main house built like a fortress with thick stone walls and narrow windows. Men watched him approach, but the flag kept them from shooting. Aldrich Boone came out onto the porch of the main house. He was a solid man in his middle 50s with iron-gray hair and a beard trimmed short. He dressed well, broadcloth coat, clean shirt, polished boots, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no without making the person regret it. "You have stones riding in here," Boone said, "or you are a fool who wants to die." "I came to offer a trade," Lakota replied. "The original documents from Hans Eller's cabin, the deed, the will, the ledger, all of it. In exchange for safe passage out of the territory for myself, Ida Miller, and her son. We disappear, you never see us again, and you keep your land." Boone studied him for a long moment. "What makes you think I will honor such a deal?" "Because Judge Alden is coming. You know that you have people watching the telegraph. And you know that if those documents reach him, you will hang for murder and theft. But if we disappear with the papers and the papers disappear with us, you have a chance. You are a respectable rancher. The judge might believe your word over the vague accusations of people who are nowhere to be found." Lakota kept his voice neutral, businesslike. "It is a better option than trying to hunt us down while the judge is already on his way." Boone's eyes narrowed. "How do I know you have not made copies?" "You do not. But copies are just copies. Without the originals, I am a savage with a grudge, and she is a widow telling stories. Easy to dismiss." A long silence broken only by the lowing of cattle and the distant hammer of a blacksmith working metal. Then Boone nodded slowly. "Where and when?" "Hans Eller's cabin. Tomorrow at noon. You bring no more than 3 men. I bring the woman and the documents. We trade, then we ride out. You never see us again. If you try to trick me," Boone said, his voice dropping to something cold and flat, "I will kill you all slowly. Your friend who stole papers from my safe, Dusty Bill, I will find him too. And anyone else who helped you. I will burn them out one by one until there is nothing left but ashes and stories no one believes." Lakota believed him, absolutely. He rode back to White Buffalo and reported to the others. Dr. Phineas looked skeptical. "He will come to that cabin meaning to kill you." "Yes," Lakota said, "but he will come, and when he does, we will be ready." That night, Father Matthias's brothers arrived quietly, 6 large, rough men who made their living hauling freight across dangerous country and knew how to handle themselves in a fight. They took positions in the cottonwoods around the cabin, armed and watchful. Dr. Phineas sent an urgent message by fast rider to Judge Alden in Willow Gap, explaining the situation and begging him to come immediately. The judge, alerted to possible violence and intrigued by the evidence mentioned, sent word back that he would ride through the night and arrive by mid-morning. Robert Hart and Sweet Sue, bitter from years of Boone's abuses, came after Dusty Bill spoke to them. Hart was a wiry man in his 50s, all lean muscle and stubborn pride. Sweet Sue was 10 years younger, with sharp eyes and the kind of face that made you think twice before lying to her. She carried a Winchester rifle with the ease of long familiarity. "We lost half our range to Boone's forged surveys," Hart said, "and 10 head of cattle to a stampede that everyone knows his men started. If you are serious about bringing him down, we will stand witness. But do not ask us to just watch. If shooting starts, we shoot back." "Fair enough," Coda said. The pieces were in place. Now they had to hope Boone would walk into the trap. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Rain from the previous day's storm had washed the sky clean, leaving it a painful blue that hurt to look at. Coda, Ida, and Gabriel rode toward Hans Eller's cabin, through prairie still wet and fragrant with sage. The cabin itself stood against the morning light, gray and alone, surrounded by the cottonwoods where armed men waited in silence. "I am frightened," Gabriel admitted. "What if something goes wrong?" "Something will go wrong," Edith said quietly. "Plans always fall apart when violence starts. But we have people watching out for us, and we have the truth on our side. Sometimes that is enough." Coda was not sure he believed that, but he admired her courage in saying it. They reached the cabin an hour before noon and took up positions inside Coda, by the door, Ida and Gabriel in the back room where they would have some cover if shooting started. Coda held the satchel of papers the copies Dr. Phineas had made, not the originals Boone already possessed. The plan depended on Boone not examining them too closely before he revealed himself. In the cottonwoods, Father Matthias's brothers waited. On the ridge beyond, Hart and Sweet Sue watched. On the road from town, Judge Alden rode hard, hoping to arrive before blood was shed. Boone arrived precisely at noon with 8 men, far more than the 3 he had agreed to. They came heavily armed, rifles, pistols, knives. They surrounded the cabin with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this kind of work before. Boone dismounted and walked to the door. He looked prosperous and powerful, every inch the successful rancher. When he spoke, his voice was affable, almost friendly. "I am here for my property." Coda stepped out, the satchel in his hands. "This is not your property. It belonged to Hans Eller, and now it belongs to his granddaughter. Hans Eller sold me this land before he died. I have a deed to prove it." "You have a forged deed. Hans never sold. You murdered him when he refused." Boone's expression did not change. "That is a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" "Yes." Coda opened the satchel and held up the copied documents. "Hans kept records. Payments you made to sheriffs, telegraph operators, land clerks, including a payment to Captain Harrow to conduct a raid that cleared this valley of Lakota families. The raid that killed my brother and 17 others." For just a moment, something flickered in Boone's eyes, calculation, reassessment. Then he smiled. "Those are copies. Copies are worthless. The originals exist. They will reach Judge Alden." "Will they?" Boone gestured, and his men raised their weapons. "You made a mistake coming here, savage. You should have taken my money and run while you had the chance." From the cabin doorway, Ida appeared and her voice rang clear. "Tell us what really happened to my grandfather, Mr. Boone. Tell us how a man who never touched alcohol fell drunk down a well." Boone's smile widened. "Your grandfather was a stubborn old fool. I offered him good money, generous money for land that was barely worth plowing. He refused out of some misguided principle about sharing water with savages. So I removed the obstacle. That is how business works on the frontier. You take what you need, or someone else takes it from you." "You murdered him," Ida said. "I pushed him down a well," Boone corrected. "There is a difference. Murder implies criminality. I simply removed an obstacle to progress. He chose to be an obstacle. He accepted the consequences." In the trees, witnesses heard every word. Father Matthias's brothers and the Harts watched and listened, memorizing every detail. "And the raid?" Coda asked, his voice tight. "The one that killed my brother?" Boone shrugged. "Indians do not own land. They wander across it like animals, contributing nothing, building nothing. I paid Captain Harrow to move them along. If some of them were too stupid to run when soldiers came shooting, that is not my concern. I needed this valley clear for productive use. I made it happen. That is what men of vision do. He had said enough, more than enough, but he was not finished. You think you are clever? Boone continued, his voice hardening. Coming here with your copies and your righteous anger. But you are nothing. Just a half-breed scout and a German widow with a brat. I have owned this territory for 15 years. I own the sheriff, the land office, the telegraph. I own everything that matters. And now I am going to own your deaths. He drew his pistol in one smooth motion and fired at Coda. The bullet missed Coda's head by perhaps 2 inches, so close he felt the wind of its passage and the sting of powder burns on his cheek. He threw himself backward through the cabin door as gunfire erupted from multiple directions at once. From the cottonwoods, Father Matthias's brothers opened fire, their shots carefully aimed to pin down Boone's men without hitting the cabin. From the ridge, Hart and Sweet Sue's rifles cracked with the steady rhythm of experienced shooters. Boone's men, caught by surprise, dove for cover behind water troughs and cottonwood trunks, returning fire wildly. Inside the cabin, Coda scrambled toward the back room where Ida and Gabriel waited. "Stay down," he shouted over the thunder of gunfire. "Away from the walls, bullets go through." He was right. Shots punched through the thin wooden walls, sending splinters flying. One bullet passed so close to Gabriel's head that it clipped a lock of his hair before embedding itself in the opposite wall. The boy screamed a high, terrified sound, and Ida pulled him down behind the heavy stone fireplace, the only solid cover in the room. Coda positioned himself at a window, using the frame for cover, and fired Dr. Phineas's revolver at Boone's men. The range was long for a pistol, and his shots went wide, but they kept the attackers honest, forced them to think twice before rushing the cabin. Outside, Boone had taken cover behind the same well where Hans Eller had died. The bitter irony was not lost on Coda. The rancher was shouting orders, trying to organize his men for a coordinated assault. "Burn them out," Boone bellowed. "Set the cabin ablaze and shoot them when they run." 2 of his men broke from cover and sprinted toward the cabin, one carrying an armful of dry brush, and the other a burning branch from their campfire. Shots from the trees drove them to ground, but not before they flung the burning brand onto the roof. The cabin's old sun-dried shingles caught instantly. Fire spread with terrifying speed, crackling and roaring as it consumed wood that had been seasoning in prairie heat for 30 years. Within seconds, flames were licking through gaps in the roof, and smoke began to fill the interior. "We have to get out," Ida shouted, coughing. "We will suffocate or burn." Gabriel was sobbing now, completely overwhelmed by terror. He pressed against his mother's face, buried in her dress, shoulders shaking with each gasping breath. Ida wrapped her arms around him and looked at Coda with eyes that asked a silent question: how do we save him? Coda's mind raced. The front door was covered by Boone's men, and they would be cut down the moment they emerged. The back window was narrow and high, barely large enough for a child, certainly not for adults. But it opened toward the creek, away from most of the attackers. "The window," he said. "Gabriel goes first, then you. I will cover and follow." "I cannot fit through that," Ida protested. "You will fit or you will burn. Those are the choices." A burning timber crashed from the roof, landing near the door and sending up a shower of sparks. The heat was building rapidly, the air becoming thick and unbreathable. Coda dragged the broken table to the back wall and climbed up, kicking out the remaining glass from the narrow window. Fresh air rushed in, blessed and cool, but it also fed the fire, which roared louder in response. "Gabriel," Coda shouted. "Up here now." The boy did not move, frozen by fear. Ida physically lifted him and pushed him toward Coda, who grabbed Gabriel and shoved him headfirst through the window. The boy's shoulders stuck. For a horrible moment, Coda thought he would not fit, and they would all die here in Hans Eller's cabin, burned alive like offerings to Boone's greed. Then Gabriel twisted, and his shoulders popped through, and he fell to the ground outside with a thump and a cry. "Your turn," Coda told Ida. She climbed up, coughing so hard she could barely stand. The smoke was thick now, black and oily, burning eyes and lungs. Coda grabbed her arms and pushed her toward the window. She got her head and shoulders through, then stuck at her hips. She was right. The opening was desperately narrow. "I cannot," she gasped. "Yes, you can." Coda braced himself and pushed, ignoring her cry of pain, as the window frame scraped skin from her ribs and hips. For a moment, she was well and truly stuck, and Coda felt panic rising. She would die here, trapped like a cork in a bottle, burned alive, while he watched helplessly. Then something gave fabric, tearing skin, yielding, and she slid through in a rush, landing hard on top of Gabriel outside. Coda turned to follow when found his path blocked by fire. The roof was collapsing, burning timbers falling like the pillars of some pagan temple brought down by an angry god. The heat was enormous, sucking the air from his lungs, blistering his skin. He had seconds, no more. He ran at the window, diving headfirst, pulling his arms in tight and trusting momentum to carry him through. His shoulders hit the frame and stuck just as Ida's hips had stuck. Outside through the window, he could see Ida and Gabriel staring at him in horror as flames licked at his back. Then hands grabbed his arms, Ida's hands stronger than they looked, and pulled. His shirt tore, skin scraped away. And then he was through, tumbling to the ground as the cabin's roof collapsed behind him with a roar that sounded like the earth breaking. They lay in the dirt behind the burning cabin, gasping and coughing, eyes, streaming clothes, smoking. There was no time to recover. Bullets kicked up dirt around them as Boone's men spotted them and adjusted their fire. "The creek," Coda croaked. "Run for the trees." They ran, stumbling and falling and getting up again, while bullets cracked past their heads and chewed up the ground at their heels. 50 yards of open ground stretched between the cabin and the creek bank, 50 yards that felt like 50 miles. Gabriel went down, tripping over his own feet, and Ida hauled him up bodily, half carrying, half dragging him. A bullet tugged at her skirt, tearing fabric but missing flesh by a finger's width. Coda turned and fired his revolver blindly behind them, not aiming, just trying to make Boone's men hesitate for a crucial second. They crashed into the underbrush along the creek and rolled down the bank into cold water that came up to their waists. Above them, bullets clipped leaves and branches, but the angle was wrong. Now the creek bank and the dense willows provided cover that the open ground had not. Upstream, Hart and Sweet Sue were pouring steady fire into Boone's position, forcing his men to keep their heads down. Father Matthias's brothers were moving through the cottonwoods, closing in on the attackers from multiple angles. It was not a rescue, not yet, but it was pressure that kept Boone from organizing the final assault that would end this. "Keep moving," Coda said, pushing Ida and Gabriel upstream, using the creek itself as cover. The water was cold enough to numb their legs, but it also put distance between them and the cabin's inferno. They rounded a bend and found themselves near the old well, the stone-lined pit where Hans Eller had died. Boone was there, crouched behind the low wall, directing his remaining men. When he saw Coda, Ida, and Gabriel emerge from the creek, his face contorted with pure rage. "You," he snarled. "You have cost me everything." He raised his pistol, aiming at Gabriel. "The boy dies first. Then you watch the woman die. Then you." Ida moved without thinking, putting herself between Boone's gun and her son. "No." Boone's finger tightened on the trigger. And then a new voice cut across the chaos. "Hold your fire, all of you. This is Federal Circuit Judge Alden, and I am ordering an immediate cessation of hostilities." Judge Alden sat astride a lathered horse at the edge of the clearing, flanked by 2 deputies with rifles across their saddles. The judge was a tall, angular man in his 60s, with a face carved by hard decisions and eyes that missed nothing. For a moment, everyone froze. Boone's men, caught between the judge's authority and their employer's orders, hesitated. Hart and Sweet Sue stopped shooting but kept their rifles trained on targets. Father Matthias's brothers emerged from the trees, weapons ready, but not aimed. Boone trapped behind the well with his pistol still raised toward Ida, and Gabriel made his calculation and chose wrong. He fired at the judge. The shot went wide. Desperation makes for poor aim. And then half a dozen rifles answered. Boone staggered, hit multiple times, and fell to his knees beside the well. Blood spread across Boone's shirt, 3 distinct patches that grew and merged. He looked down at them with an expression of puzzlement, as if unable to comprehend that his body had betrayed him. Then he looked up at Coda, who had pulled himself from the creek and now stood 5 feet away. "You think you have won," Boone rasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "But there are 100 more like me, men who see what needs to be done and have the stones to do it. You cannot stop progress. You can only get crushed by it." "Maybe," Coda said, "but we stopped you. That is enough for today." Boone tried to speak again, but blood filled his mouth. He toppled sideways, his shoulders striking the stone rim of the well, and then slid down to lie at its base, as close to where Hans Eller had died as it was possible to get. The irony was not lost on anyone. Judge Alden dismounted and walked to Boone's body, checking for a pulse he would not find. Then he turned to the assembled crowd, Coda, Ida, and Gabriel soaked and scorched. Father Matthias's brothers emerging from the trees, Hart and Sweet Sue descending from the ridge, Dr. Phineas and Dusty Bill arriving at a run from where they had been waiting with the horses. "Someone," the judge said in a voice that expected to be obeyed, "is going to explain to me what in blazes just happened here." They told him everything. Coda showed him the copies of Hans's documents and Dusty Bill's stolen letter from Captain Harrow. Ida told the story of her grandfather's death and Boone's threats. Father Matthias's brothers Hart and Sweet Sue all confirmed that they had heard Boone confess to murder and to paying for the raid at White Buffalo Creek. Dusty Bill gave his own testimony, standing gray-faced and trembling, but determined. "I was there when Boone killed Hans Eller. I held the lantern. I took his money to stay quiet. But I am testifying now under oath, if you require it, that Aldrich Boone murdered Hans Eller on April 15th, 1852, by pushing him down that well. And I am testifying that Boone paid Captain Harrow $500 in gold to conduct the raid at White Buffalo Creek that killed 17 Lakota people. I am guilty as an accessory, and I am willing to face whatever punishment that brings. But I am telling the truth now, while I still can." Judge Alden examined the documents carefully. He took statements from every witness, writing them down in a leather-bound notebook he produced from his saddlebag. When he finished, he removed his hat and ran a hand through his gray hair. "This is one of the ugliest cases I have encountered in 30 years on the bench," he said. "Murder, theft, conspiracy, fraud. Boone will not hang because he is already dead. But his estate will be seized under territorial law, his holdings distributed to his victims, and every man who took his bribes will face charges." He looked at Ida. "Mrs. Muller, Hans Eller's land belongs to you and your son by right of inheritance. I will file the necessary paperwork myself." Tears ran down Ida's face, cutting tracks through the soot and grime. "Thank you," she whispered. Judge Alden turned to Coda. I cannot give you back your brother or undo the raid that killed him. But I can promise that Captain Harrow will be court-martialed if he is still in service, and that this raid will be investigated by the War Department. It is less than you deserve, but it is what I can offer." "It is more than I expected," Coda said and meant it. Dusty Bill, leaning heavily on Dr. Phineas, coughed wetly. "I want my confession on record. Every detail. When I die, and it will not be long, I want it known that at least I tried to tell the truth at the end." "It will be recorded," Judge Alden promised, "and weighed in your favor when the final accounting comes." Dusty Bill died 3 days later, his testimony complete and witnessed. They buried him in the churchyard in White Buffalo with a simple marker that read, "William Archer, he spoke truth when it mattered." Father Matthias said words over his grave, and even Ida, who had every reason to hate him, came to stand witness as they lowered him into the ground. "He was a weak man who did terrible things," she said afterward. "But at least he tried to make it right before the end." That takes a kind of courage, too. In the weeks that followed, the territory underwent a transformation. With Boone dead and his network of bribes exposed, people began speaking openly about injustices they had endured in silence. Sheriff Montgomery Pike was arrested and charged as an accessory to murder. The telegraph operator who had delayed messages was dismissed and replaced. The land office clerk who had forged Hans's signature lost his position and faced criminal charges. Small ranchers like Robert Hart began reclaiming land that had been stolen through fraudulent surveys. The Lakota families who had been driven from the valley began tentatively to return, testing whether the promises of a new order would hold. Ida Gabriel and Coda returned to Hans Eller's land, or what remained of it. The cabin was a charred ruin, blackened stone chimney, and foundation the only things left standing. They stood in the ashes and looked at what needed rebuilding. "It will take months," Ida said. "We have months," Coda replied. "And we have help." The help came from unexpected places. Hart and Sweet Sue arrived with timber salvaged from an old barn. Dr. Phineas brought nails and window glass, purchased with money from his own meager savings. Father Matthias organized work parties from his congregation, and his brothers donated their labor for free. Even some of Boone's former ranch hands, suddenly unemployed, and looking to make amends for past misdeeds, offered their skills. The new cabin rose slowly through the summer and into fall. It was built stronger than Hans's original stone walls, 3 feet thick, a slate roof that would not burn windows, placed to give clear views of anyone approaching. A root cellar was dug deep into the hillside, lined with stone large enough to store food for a hard winter. As they worked, Coda and Ida developed a rhythm and an understanding that grew naturally from shared labor and survival. She learned to read weather signs in the way clouds moved and birds flew. He learned German words and songs her mother had taught her. Gabriel grew taller and stronger, his hands developing the calluses of honest work. There were moments of connection that neither Coda nor Ida named, but both felt. Once working on the roof beam in golden afternoon light, he reached to steady her as she stretched to fit a board in place, and their hands touched and held for a moment longer than necessary. Another time, she brought water to where he was digging post holes, and as she handed him the dipper, their fingers brushed and their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. They did not speak of love or marriage or future beyond the next season's planting. They were both too scarred, too cautious, too aware of how quickly fate could take everything away. But they were learning to trust, and trust was the foundation on which other things could be built when the time was right. By the time the first significant snow fell, the cabin was finished and warm. Ida cooked their first meal in the new hearth venison stew with wild onions and potatoes from the garden she had planted. and they sat together at a table Coda had built from cottonwood. To Hans Eller, Dr. Phineas said, raising a cup of coffee in salute, who died defending what was right. To Chatan, Coda said quietly, and to all the others who were sacrificed to one man's greed. They drank, and the moment felt like both an ending and a beginning. Winter came hard that year. Snow piled deep around the cabin, and wind howled across the prairie like the voices of all the ghosts they carried. But inside, the fire burned warm, and there was food in the cellar, and the roof did not leak. Gabriel spent the dark months learning to read and write from books Dr. Phineas provided. Ida sewed and mended. Coda repaired tools, crafted furniture, and told stories of his people's history, the world that had existed before boundaries and reservations and men like Boone. One evening in late February, when the days were just beginning to lengthen and the worst of winter was breaking, Gabriel asked if he could explore along the creek bank. "The ice is starting to melt," he said. "I want to see how high the water will get." Ida agreed, and the boy bundled into his coat and mittens. Coda went with him more out of habit than necessity. Gabriel had grown competent and careful, and the land immediately around the cabin was familiar now. They walked along the creek, where ice still clung to the banks in translucent sheets. Gabriel scrambled up to examine the old cottonwood, the massive tree that Hans had mentioned in letters as the grandfather tree older than any man's memory. At its base, sheltered by roots thick as a man's thigh, Gabriel's boot struck something that rang metallic. He knelt and dug with his hands, uncovering a metal box wrapped in canvas. "Coda, there is something buried here." They carried it back to the cabin. Ida, seeing their expressions, set aside her sewing. Coda opened the box with his knife. Inside were more papers older than the first batch. Another deed, this one dated 1843. Its ink faded brown, but still legible. It granted shared grazing and water rights along White Buffalo Creek to Hans Eller and his heirs in perpetuity, and to the band of Lakota peoples whose seasonal camps have for generations occupied these lands. It was signed by a territorial commissioner, by Hans Eller, and by a Lakota leader whose mark made Coda's breath catch a stylized eagle with outstretched wings. "White Eagle," Coda said, his voice rough. "My grandfather's brother. He died before I was born, but my grandmother spoke of him often. He was a leader who tried to build peace when others wanted only war." Beneath the deed was another letter, this one in Hans's handwriting. "To my daughter Anna and her children. If you are reading this, you have found the papers I hid under the cabin floor. But those papers only tell half the story. This box contains the other half, the promise I made to Chief White Eagle when I first came to this land. The Lakota were here first. They had every right to drive me away or kill me. Instead, White Eagle came to me under a flag of truce and proposed a compromise. I could build my cabin and work this land, and in exchange, I would not interfere with their seasonal camps downstream, and I would defend their right to use the creek water. We signed this agreement before a government commissioner who believed, as I did, that the land was large enough for everyone if we learned to share instead of steal. When Aldrich Boone tried to buy my land, I refused, not just because the price was unfair, but because I had given my word to White Eagle. A man's word is the only thing he truly owns. Break it, and you are nothing. I buried this box separately because I feared Boone might find the papers in the cabin. If he takes my life, I wanted to make sure this promise would survive me. If you have this land now, you have it because you are my blood. But remember, it was also promised to the Lakota, and that promise is as sacred as any deed. Honor it. Protect the water. Share the land with those who need it. Your grandfather, Hans Eller, P.S. In this box, you will also find a gift given to me by White Eagle. When we signed our agreement, a carved horse made by his own hand, marked with symbols of protection and continuity. It represents the promise that our families would share this land across generations. Keep it safe. Pass it down. Remember, at the bottom of the box, wrapped in soft leather, was the carved horse. It was perhaps 6 inches long, made from cottonwood painted with red and black symbols. Gabriel lifted it carefully, turning it in the lamplight. Coda took it with trembling hands. The symbols were Lakota. He recognized them from childhood. The zigzag for lightning, the circle for sacred hoop, the bird for freedom. But what made his throat close and his eyes sting was the specific style of the carving, and the way the horse's mane swept back, the angle of the legs, the curve of the neck. He had seen this style before. His grandmother had shown him pieces carved by White Eagle, including a small figure she kept wrapped in doeskin, a buffalo carved as a companion piece to a horse that had been given away as part of a great promise. This was carved by my great-uncle. Coda said, his voice barely above a whisper. White Eagle. He made this with his own hands as a symbol of the agreement with Hans. Gabriel, watching Coda's face, understood the significance without fully grasping all the details. He reached out and pressed the horse into Coda's hands. Then you should keep it. So you remember this land is yours too, not just ours. Both. Coda's hands closed around the small wooden horse. It fit his palm as if it had been made for him, as in a way it had been. Made by his ancestor, given to Ida's ancestor, preserved across decades and disasters, and now returned to him in this moment. Your grandfather and my great-uncle made a promise to each other, he said, looking at Ida. To share this land, this water, this space. Boone tried to destroy that promise. He murdered Hans, paid soldiers to drive my people away, buried the truth under lies, and forged papers. He lifted the deed. But the truth survived. Hans hid it. You found it. And now we have the chance to honor what they started. Ida reached out and took Coda's free hand in hers, the first time she had done so deliberately, in full view, with intention and understanding. Then we will honor it, she said. We will build what they dreamed of. A place where families from different worlds can live side by side, share the water-raised children who know how to see each other as human. Gabriel looked between them, seeing something in their faces that made him smile, despite not entirely understanding it yet. Will there be more people coming? More Lakota families? In time, Coda said. If they will trust us. If we prove the promise is real. Over the following weeks and months, word spread through the scattered Lakota communities about the deed that had been found, about Hans Eller's promise, about the land, opened for shared use. Some were skeptical too many promises had been broken. But slowly, cautiously, a few families began to return. Coda and Ida built a second, smaller cabin near the creek for seasonal use. When Lakota families came through following traditional migration routes, they could stop there, water their horses, rest, hunt. It was a fraction of what had been taken, but it was a beginning. Gabriel became the bridge running between the main cabin and the seasonal camp. With the enthusiasm of a boy who had discovered the world was larger and more interesting than he had imagined. He learned Lakota words and taught German phrases in return, creating a hybrid language of hand signs and borrowed vocabulary that made everyone laugh. One spring evening, nearly a year after Boone's death, Coda and Ida sat on the porch of the cabin they had built together. The sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Gabriel was down at the creek with 2 Lakota boys his age, fishing and arguing about the best way to bait a hook. Do you think it will last? Ida asked. What we are trying to build here. Coda considered the question seriously. There will always be men like Boone, men who see land as something to own rather than something to share. But there will also be men like your grandfather, and women like you, and children like Gabriel and those boys at the creek, who think it is normal to have neighbors from different worlds. He paused. Maybe that is enough. Not to win forever, but to hold the line long enough for the next generation to learn better. Ida reached over and took his hand. They sat in silence as stars emerged, and the night sounds of the prairie rose around them, coyotes singing, an owl calling, the distant murmur of boys' voices carrying on the evening air. Inside the cabin, on the mantel above the fireplace, the carved horse sat in a place of honor. It was small, just wood and paint, but it carried the weight of promises kept and futures made possible. It had traveled through decades and disasters, from White Eagle's hands to Hans Eller's, preserved through murder and theft and fire, and delivered at last to the people who would honor what it represented. The land stretched wide around them, no longer a battleground, not yet a paradise, but a place where different stories could coexist, where old wounds might heal, where what had been stolen was slowly, painfully being restored. It was not justice, not complete. The dead could not be brought back. The years of suffering could not be erased. But it was something real and solid and good. And for people who had survived the worst that greed and violence could inflict, that was enough. More than enough. It was a beginning.